The Korean War was a pivotal, multifaceted conflict that shaped the contours of the Cold War and had profound implications for international politics, military doctrine, and the future of the Korean Peninsula. Often called the Forgotten War, it is overshadowed in Western memory by the colossal scale of World War II and the controversy of the Vietnam War. Yet its influence on global strategy, East Asian development, and the norms of international intervention is deeply significant. This conflict marked the first military tests of the United Nations and the first proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union, setting a precedent for superpower engagement throughout the Cold War. With roughly 5 million casualties, including over 2 million civilians, the war exacted a steep toll and left behind a divided Korea, the repercussions of which continue to reverberate today. This video will explore the Korean War across its full spectrum: the historical background, the initial conflict, major military campaigns, foreign involvement, civilian impact, armistice negotiations, and the enduring legacy of divisions. Historical background and division of Korea. Korea's division at the 38th parallel in 1945 was born of geopolitical expediency, not historical or cultural logic. For centuries, Korea had existed as a unified cultural and political entity, often under foreign pressure. Its annexation by Japan in 1910 subjugated the Korean people to harsh colonial rule. Forced labor, suppression of language and religion, and resource extraction defined everyday life. The Korean resistance, fragmented yet persistent, erupted in major protests such as the 1919 March 1st movement, brutally suppressed by Japanese authorities. World War II's end brought both liberation and an unforeseen schism. With Japan's surrender, U.S. and Soviet forces divided the peninsula at the 38th parallel for the purposes of disarmament, inadvertently laying the foundation for long-term division. While intended as a temporary measure, the parallel soon hardened into a border, especially as Cold War tensions intensified. The Soviet Union installed Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter and Red Army officer, as leader of the North. In the South, Syngman Rhee, a staunchly anti-communist Korean nationalist educated in the U.S., took the reins. Both leaders refused to recognize the legitimacy of the other. By 1948, two ideologically opposed states emerged: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea. The withdrawal of Soviet and U.S. forces in 1948 to 49 left two rival regimes heavily armed and deeply suspicious, creating a powder keg. The road to war, escalation and invasion. Between 1948 and 1950, numerous clashes occurred along the 38th parallel. Both sides conducted border raids, psychological operations, and subversive propaganda campaigns. Internally, North Korea began collectivizing land and industry, while South Korea saw mass protests, labor strikes, and leftist uprising, often harshly suppressed by Rhee's regime. Kim Il-sung, emboldened by support from Stalin and Mao, believed the military campaign could quickly reunify Korea. He argued that the South's government was unpopular and weak, and that a northern offensive would spark a popular uprising. Stalin, initially hesitant, gave his blessing in early 1950 after securing Chinese support and Soviet military aid for North Korea. Thus began the preparation for what Kim called a liberation war. The invasion and early UN response. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a surprise attack involving over 135,000 troops, Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks, and concentrated artillery. Seoul fell within 3 days. The South Korean army, under-equipped and unprepared, disintegrated under the pressure. U.S. President Harry S. Truman, perceiving the invasion as a communist expansionism orchestrated by Moscow, acted swiftly. The UN Security Council, taking advantage of a Soviet boycott, passed Resolution 82 condemning North Korea and Resolution 83 calling for military assistance to South Korea. The U.S. rapidly deployed air and naval forces, followed by ground troops to support the Republic of Korea. By early August, the United Nations Command, led by General Douglas MacArthur, had established a defensive line around the southeastern port of Busan. Here began one of the most critical battles of the war. The Busan perimeter was a crescent-shaped defense line stretching from the Nakdong River to the Sea of Japan. Over 6 weeks, North Korean forces launched wave after wave of assaults against the encircled UN troops. Despite suffering severe losses, UN and ROK forces held firm, aided by massive U.S. air power, naval gunfire, and continuous reinforcements arriving via Busan port. This period saw the arrival of troops from the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Turkey, and other UN members. While the U.S. contributed over 90% of combat personnel, the multinational nature of the force lent the war broader legitimacy. Each contributing nation brought its own military traditions and challenges, adding complexity to coalition warfare. The Incheon landing and recapture of Seoul. MacArthur, known for his audacity, proposed an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city near Seoul, to outflank the North Korean army. Despite reservations from his staff due to difficult tides and narrow channels, the plan was approved. On September 15, 1950, UN forces landed at Incheon, catching the enemy off guard. Within days, Seoul was recaptured. Simultaneously, forces at the Pusan perimeter launched a breakout offensive, joining with the Incheon landing forces and crushing the North Korean invaders. By early October, North Korean troops had retreated beyond the 38th parallel. Emboldened by success, the UN authorized a push northward to eliminate the communist regime entirely, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Chinese intervention and escalation. As UN forces advanced toward the Yalu River, which marked the border between North Korea and China, Chinese leaders grew increasingly alarmed. Mao Zedong interpreted the approach of Western forces as a strategic threat to Chinese security. Despite internal debate and logistical concerns, China began secretly moving troops into North Korea under the banner of the Chinese People's Volunteers. In late October 1950, Chinese troops ambushed UN forces in the mountains of North Korea, initiating a new phase of the war. In November, a massive Chinese offensive struck across a broad front, catching the UN forces off guard. The Battle of the Cheongchong River forced a full retreat. U.S. Marines at the Chosin Reservoir executed a fighting withdrawal under dire conditions. Tens of thousands of troops and civilians were evacuated by sea from Hungnam. By January 1951, the Chinese-North Korean alliance had recaptured Seoul, though momentum had fully shifted and the war entered a new and more uncertain phase. Stalemate and attritional warfare. After recapturing Seoul, Chinese and North Korean forces continued pushing south, but logistical strains, terrain challenges, and fierce UN resistance halted their advance. By spring 1951, the UN mounted counteroffensives under General Matthew Ridgway, eventually retaking Seoul and stabilizing the front near the 38th parallel. From mid-1951 onward, the war devolved into trench warfare. Both sides dug defensive positions resembling those of World War I. Battles were fought for strategic hills, Heartbreak Ridge, Porkchop Hill, Old Baldy, that changed hands frequently at enormous cost and lives. Meanwhile, the U.S. Air Force bombarded North Korean infrastructure, hoping to erode enemy capacity and morale. Negotiations began in July 1951 at Kaesong, later moved to Panmunjom, but progress was painfully slow. Disputes over prisoner repatriation, the ceasefire line, and political recognition prevented swift resolution. Despite battlefield stalemate, soldiers continued dying daily, and civilians endured suffering under bombardment, displacement, and shortages. By mid-1951, it became increasingly clear to both sides that neither would be able to achieve outright victory without unacceptable cost. Stalemate on the battlefield, exhaustion among the troops, and mounting international pressure pushed the belligerents towards diplomacy. One of the thorniest issues was the repatriation of prisoners of war. The United Nations insisted on voluntary repatriation, respecting the wishes of prisoners who did not want to return to North Korea or China. This position was supported by the Geneva Conventions but rejected outright by North Korea and China, who demanded full return. The dispute dragged the talks into a lengthy impasse. Military operations continued in parallel with diplomacy. The United Nations launched limited offensives to capture advantageous terrain. Notably, battles such as the Second Battle of the Hook and fights for outposts Harry and T-Bone Hill illustrated the continuing intensity of the conflict. These engagements, while tactically minor, were strategically important to shape the final armistice line. A turning point came in March 1953 when Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died. The subsequent leadership in Moscow favored a negotiated settlement to reduce tensions with the West. Additionally, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had taken office in January 1953, hinted at using nuclear weapons if the conflict could not be resolved, a form of diplomatic brinkmanship. Finally, an agreement was reached. On July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. It established a demilitarized zone approximately along the 38th parallel, stretching 250 kilometers across the peninsula and 4 kilometers wide. It also created mechanisms such as the Military Armistice Commission to supervise the ceasefire. Importantly, South Korea did not sign the agreement. President Ri objected to any settlement that did not achieve full reunification and was only reluctantly persuaded to accept the armistice through American assurances of continued military and economic support. The armistice brought an end to active hostilities, but not to the war itself. No formal peace treaty has ever been signed, and technically, North and South Korea remain in a state of war to this day. Post-war Korea, two diverging paths. The war left the Korean peninsula devastated. Millions of Koreans were dead, wounded, or displaced. Infrastructure was in ruins, cities destroyed, and families divided. Yet the post-war trajectories of North and South Korea diverged sharply in the decades that followed. In the South, under American patronage, reconstruction efforts began with economic aid, food assistance, and political support. Although initially ruled by authoritarian regimes, South Korea embarked on rapid industrialization beginning in the 1960s. Known as the Miracle on the Han River, this transformation turned South Korea into one of the world's leading economies. By the 1980s and 1990s, it transitioned to a stable democracy with robust civil society and thriving technology sectors. In the North, Kim Il-sung consolidated power into a totalitarian state centered around the Juche ideology, self-reliance fused with militarized nationalism. With help from Soviet and Chinese aid, North Korea initially experienced industrial growth, even outpacing the South in the 1950s. However, economic mismanagement, resource scarcity, and extreme isolation led to stagnation by the 1970s. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 further devastated its economy, culminating in a famine that killed hundreds of thousands in the 1990s. While South Korea integrated into the global economy, North Korea turned inward, becoming increasingly reliant on military coercion, internal surveillance, and eventually nuclear brinkmanship. The contrast between the two Koreas became a stark symbol of ideological divergence and the long-term impact of Cold War geopolitics. The legacy of division and modern implications. The Korean War entrenched the division of the peninsula. The DMZ remains the most heavily fortified border in the world, symbolizing the ongoing tensions between the North and the South. Despite occasional diplomatic efforts, reunification remains elusive. Militarily, the war shaped U.S. policy for decades. The U.S.-South Korea alliance became a cornerstone of American strategy in East Asia. Today, roughly 28,000 American troops remain stationed in South Korea as a deterrent against northern aggression. Joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, and nuclear umbrella assurances form the backbone of this alliance. In the North, the war has been memorialized as a foundational moment of defiance against imperialism. The Kim regime used the memory of the war to justify its military-first policies and nuclear development. North Korean propaganda presents the U.S. as an ever-present threat, citing the Korean War as proof of its hostility. Globally, the Korean War shaped perceptions of limited war in the nuclear age. It demonstrated the dangers of proxy conflicts and underscored the importance of containment policy. The war also left a legacy in military technology and doctrine. It saw the first jet-on-jet combat, the first use of helicopters for medical evacuation, and innovations in combined arms warfare. The human cost and cultural memory. The human toll of the Korean War is staggering. More than 1.2 million South Koreans, 1 million Chinese, and approximately 600,000 North Koreans died. The United States suffered over 36,000 combat deaths, with thousands more wounded or missing. Many UN nations also bore heavy losses. Civilian casualties, including displacement and starvation, comprised more than half of the total war deaths. Massacres and atrocities occurred on both sides, including the No-Gun Ri massacre and the execution of political prisoners. These dark chapters have been the subject of both historical inquiry and diplomatic tension. In the West, the Korean War became known as the Forgotten War, overshadowed by World War II's heroism and Vietnam's controversy. However, efforts to honor Korean War veterans have grown in recent decades. Memorials, oral history projects, and scholarly work have begun to fill in the gaps left by previous generations. In South Korea, the war is a defining moment in the national consciousness. It is taught in schools, commemorated in museums, and remembered through annual ceremonies. For North Koreans, it remains an ideological cornerstone, though interpreted through the lens of regime propaganda rather than objective history. Until a true peace replaces the 1953 armistice, the war's shadow will continue to stretch across the Korean peninsula and the world. Thanks for watching.